In a time before this time, animals didn't have the colours in their skin or in their feathers or in their fur. All of the animals were completely white. They had no clothes to wear, they had no feathers that they could show off with, and all of the animals heard that there was going to be a ball, a dance, where everyone was invited. And for the first time in their lives, they decided that they would want to show off their finery. So all of the animals looked this way and that to see if they could find ways of painting stripes or having colour in their skin or fur or feathers. But I'll tell you this, the flamingo was indifferent to it all. White from the tip of its nose to the tip of its tail, all the way down its legs. It was only as it looked around and saw the elephant with its fine grey coat upon its skin, saw the leopard with its spots, the tiger with its stripes, saw the pelicans and cormorants with the colour in their skins, that it decided that it would get some colour and it would find some fine clothes to wear. But with every animal all trying to find some clothes to wear, there were a shortage of tailors. And the only one that the flamingos could find was the owl. Now, as it turned out, the owl was the finest of all tailors, who could cut and stitch better than anyone else. But all of his materials had been used, and all he could make for the flamingo were a pair of trousers. Thin trousers, but they were beautifully coloured. The flamingo watched as the owl cut out the material. It seemed quite dark and scaly. It didn't seem as soft as the fur of, say, a bear. But the flamingos were quite happy to have any kind of clothes, especially if they were going to go to the dance and to the ball and to be seen. When those trousers were stitched and placed upon the flamingo's legs, its body, its feathers were still white, but it did not care. It felt so proud. It had beautiful clothes, clothes that it could wear, clothes and finery, just like you or I, and it strutted into that place. And all of the animals were dancing this way and that, with all of their stripes, with all of their colours, with all of the beautiful clothes that they had upon their backs. And everyone admired the flamingos. They loved the trousers that fitted so well upon their legs. But the coral snakes looked. They recognised the material. It was not cotton, it was not cloth, it was not fur, it was skin. It was the skin of snakes. And the coral snakes were not pleased to see that their brothers had been used to make trousers for the proud and haughty flamingos, and so they brought their fangs and started to peck at the legs of the flamingos, and soon the blood dripped down and made their legs quite bright and red. And now the coral snakes chased the flamingos this way and that, with all of their fangs out and ready, and there was nowhere that the flamingos could go except to the middle of a pond or a lake at sunset. And they stood there and they washed their legs one at a time, rubbing one leg against the other, the legs which now did not look like the skin of snakes but red as blood. And as they stood there each night at sunrise and sunset, their white feathers took on the colour of the morning or evening sun. And that is why to this day you will find flamingos all standing in the middle of the lakes, so they're far away from all of the coral snakes who would bite and snap at their legs. And their feathers are as bright and as pink as a dying sun.
He was a fisherman. Of this there was no doubt. Living by the side of the sea where the waves would roll and rock, the boats were all ready to go out and catch fish. And that is just what he did. He was tall, he was strong, he was handsome. And every day when he threw out his net, he would always catch fish. No matter where he went, his net was always full. He was strong in his arm, he was handsome in his face, his back was straight. And it wasn't just those women who walk upon two legs who found him attractive. Oh no. Underneath the water there would be mermaids, half a woman and half a fish, who would look up through the water and see just how handsome this fisherman was. Now, he did have a wife and a horse and a dog, but these mermaids would make sure that they would always fill his nets just so that they could see him standing there, tall and strong, casting out his net and catching his fish. Now, he had a house, a wife, a dog and a horse. But as we all do, one day he spoke out loud as the sunset was crowding around him. He spoke out loud and said, "I wonder what it would be like to have a son or a daughter by my side." The chiefest of all of the mermaids heard him, and she went and she swam further and deeper down to the ocean floor and found a fish that was as wide as a man's hand, as long as a man's arm, round golden eyes and beautiful blood-red fins at its neck. And she placed that inside of the fisherman's net. Now, he'd been used to catching long, thin silver fish, and when he pulled in his net and saw this beautiful golden fish, he was surprised. And he spoke out loud, "I've never seen a fish like that before." And now the chiefest of all of the mermaids came to the top of the water and whispered above the waves, "Take that fish. Take the fish and wash it. Cut off its fins, and the water that you use, give that to your dog. Then scrape the fish and all of the scaly water, wash it off and give that to your horse. Finally, you must gut the fish and wash the fish and give the blooded water to your wife. And then you and you alone must eat the fish." The fisherman was surprised. He didn't know where this voice was coming from, but still, he did as he was asked. After he'd sold all of the silver fish to the king, he came back and he washed the fish and cut off its fins and gave that water to his dog. Then he scaled the fish and washed the fish and gave that to his horse. And when he had gutted the fish and washed the fish, he gave that to his wife. And in what seemed no more than a passing sigh across the moon, he found that his dog was with puppies. He found that his horse was with foals. He found that his wife was with child. And sure enough, the dog gave birth to two beautiful chestnut brown dogs that were the spit of one another. No one could tell them apart. And the horse gave birth to two beautiful foals. And again, no one could tell them apart. And his wife gave birth to twins, two boys, and no one could tell them apart. He was so overjoyed at having children like this that he took two olive branches and placed them in the ground, just to remember the day that he was a father to two sons. He took the fish. He cooked it, only for himself. But when he cut into one side of the fish, he found inside of the fish that there was a sword, a golden sword, no longer than your little finger. And on the other side of the fish there was another golden sword, no longer than your finger. And he did not know what to do with them at first, but since he had planted the olive branches, he decided to place them in the ground. And here is a strange thing, because those swords grew taller, longer and sharper. But so did his sons. It was almost as if they were growing faster than any child in all of this world, and when they were 5 years old, they were given the dogs to look after. And one boy called his dog Chain Maker, and the second dog with the second child was called Chain Breaker. And they rode upon their 2 horses, and to be perfectly honest, it was probably only their parents who could tell the 2 apart. The olive branches grew taller and stronger, and if one of the children were ill, then the leaves on that olive branch would wither until they had become well again. So here is the thing. They grew bigger and obeyed their father and mother and learned to fish as their father had fished. But one day, when the oldest one, and yes, I know that they are twins, but there is always one child that is born slightly earlier than the other, the oldest one decided that he wished to go out and see what he could see in all of the world. And so he went to his father. "Father, I would wish to go out on a journey upon my horse with Chain Maker by my side and see the world. Please give me your blessing." The father smiled. "I shall give you more than just my blessing. I shall give you the golden sword." For now the sword was fully formed, sharp, bright and brilliant. And this boy set off on his way. He waved goodbye to his younger brother, and he went away from the side of the sea and went along a road. Now, as he was riding with Chain Maker by his side upon his horse and riding, he rode through lush green meadows by the sides of great forests, and then in a clearing he saw that there was a beautiful castle, white and wide with golden gates at its front. And as he got closer to it, from out of the castle there came a king with a crown upon his head and beautiful robes upon his back. And he looked and he said, "Welcome, kind stranger. You are welcome to my land and to my castle. What is it that you do?" The oldest of the twins looked and said, "Your Majesty, I am travelling far around to see what I can see of all of this world." But the king did not live inside of the castle alone. He had not one but 2 daughters. They were not twins, but he had 2 daughters. And he looked and he said to this fisherman's son, "Which of my 2 daughters pleases you the most? For you can marry her." Well, it so happened that he, being the oldest son, looked towards the 2 sisters, and it was the oldest that he liked. And the 2 of them were married. A cardinal was there. A mayor came to the wedding. But on the wedding day, his new wife said to him, "You are welcome to travel inside of all of this great castle, but please promise me that you will not go down to the bottommost part of the castle and look out of the window that is there." He thought it was a strange request, but he agreed to it. And he wandered about the castle with its great and beautiful staircases, its fountains, all of the beautiful stonework. And he loved that place. He loved to be inside of the great castle. He would wander along the corridors. He would marvel at the way that the castle itself had been made. But curiosity is a terrible thing. He had been told not to go to the window at the bottommost part of the castle. He'd been told not to look outside. And inside of his heart, he'd placed such a great dread that he thought it must be a terrible thing. But curiosity is a terrible thing. And one day he could not stop himself. He went to the window and he looked out and he saw that there was a land that was filled with tall, lush, sweet green grass. And when he spoke to his wife, he looked at her and said, "Why did you tell me not to look out of the window? There is nothing but a fine meadow outside of the window." And here his wife wept and wailed, screamed and cried, "You have looked out towards the land where many will go but none return, and now you will have a curiosity inside of you that you will not be satisfied until you go." It was true. He couldn't stop himself. All he wanted to do was ride upon his horse and have Chainmaker by his side. And one day his wife knew there was no chance that she could keep him trapped inside of the castle, and she got some servants to make sure that his horse was ready, to make sure that Chainmaker was ready. And off he rode. And as he rode along the way, he saw that the tall, sweet green grass was fine for the horse to eat. It was good and it was plentiful, but then it was as if the grass was being covered with dust, and the grass was no longer as green. And then his nose, he could smell sausages, fat, meaty pork sausages being cooked. And in the distance, when he looked, he could see that there was a small house. And all around the house there were stones about the size of men and women, dogs and horses. But he paid no heed to that, for the smell of the sausages was just so much that he could not stop himself, and he rode a little faster, never looking to see that the grass was shorter and more covered in dust. And in time, when he got to the house, he saw that there was a woman, an old woman, who had teeth that hung down and curved around her jaw, and on the top of her head all she had were 12 strands of hair. She looked at him and said, "Oh, sir, you are welcome inside of my house, but please," and here she pulled the hairs from the top of her head and gave 6 in one hand and 6 in the other, and said, "Oh, please, I do not wish to be bitten by your dog. I do not wish to be trampled by your horse. Please tie them up and use my hair to attach them to the side of the house, so that I will be safer, and then I shall give to you food, pork sausages, fat, round and meaty." He had travelled for some time and he was hungry, and so he took these strands of the old woman's hair and tied them firmly around Chainmaker's neck, and tied it around his horse's neck, and tied it, and went inside and sat himself down at the table. The old woman with the terrible teeth and a bald head started to bustle all around him. "Oh, such a fine young man, a beautiful young man. You are welcome inside of my house." And she went outside, and by her side and from a belt she had a bag, and in the bag there was dust, and she pulled out some of the dust and she blew it into the face of Chainmaker, and the dog turned to stone, and the hairs upon her head that had been used to tie it turned into iron. She went to his horse and took another handful of dust and blew it into the eyes and nose of his horse, and his horse too became like stone, with an iron chain about its neck. as she bustled and fussed by him, "Such a fine young man, such a beautiful young man, come here and eat." And with the sausages upon the plate, all he could look at was the food. And as he was just about to eat, she took some of the dust and into his eyes, and he too was turned to stone. His lifeless body was dragged outside and placed in all of the serried ranks of all of the other people who had come to this land where no one returns. And the old woman had sat and ate the sausages herself. Now, down by the side of the sea, his younger brother looked towards the olive branch that had been planted upon the day that he had been born, and he could see that his brother's branch was starting to wither, and he knew that his brother was in trouble. He went to his father. "My father, I would wish to go and find what it is that has happened to my brother." The father was frantic, for he too knew that there must be some danger involved in this place. And so, the youngest one got himself ready, placed a scarf about his neck, and went on his way. He had his horse, he had chain breaker by his side, and sure enough, as he rode along, he went till he came to where there was the castle. And the king came out, and he did not know, for they were twins, he did not know that this boy who had arrived there was a twin to the first one that he'd seen. my son, you are welcome here. Come and sit with us." And the wife, the oldest of the king's daughters, thought that her husband had returned. She fussed about him, she pulled at him, she said, "Oh, I am so pleased that you have returned and now you are here. It is good to see you back, for many have gone but none have returned, and you have come back." And the youngest brother looked and thought, "This woman thinks that I am my brother. She thinks that I am her husband." And all throughout the meal she fed him, she fussed about him, she moved around him, she looked at him, she said, "Oh, it is good to have you back, you are welcome back. It's good that you have gone like no one else has gone, and you have returned." And the younger one was starting to get very worried, because now the night was drawing in, and his brother's wife would wish for him to lie down in a bed with her. What could he do? And now, as the youngest brother lay down in that place, which was not his place, lay down upon the bed that was his brother's bed, with his brother's wife, he did not know what to do. But then it occurred to him. He took his great golden sword and placed it in the middle of the bed, with the point towards him and the hilt towards his brother's wife. And she spoke and she looked at him and said, "Why do you place this great golden sword down the middle of the bed?" The youngest brother spoke. "It is because I have been given a vow. I have been given a task, and I must leave this sword in the middle of the bed." His brother's wife fell asleep. But all through that night, he fretted and worried and wondered what could possibly have happened to his older brother. The next morning, when he arose, he tried to work out what had happened to his brother, to his oldest brother. He didn't know where he could possibly be, and he looked all around the castle. And he went down to the bottommost part of the castle and found the window and looked out. And he called to his brother's wife. He said, "What is this window and where is this land?" His brother's wife looked at him and said, "But surely, my dear, that is the land that you went to and you returned from, where no one else has ever returned." And so he knew that that was where his brother must be. He called for his horse, and he called for Chain Breaker to be made ready so that he could go and travel and find his brother. And as before, he rode along that way. He rode through all of the sweet green grass until it became dusted, and then he could smell the pork sausages in the air and see the house. As he was getting closer, he could see all of these statues lying up in long straight rows, and some of them he could recognise as men and women, dogs and horses. But it was when he got to the cottage, and there was the woman with her terrible teeth that hung down by her jaw, and now she only had 2 hairs on the top of her head. She looked and said, "Oh, good sir, you're welcome in this place. Please take these hairs, and 1 and 2, and tie up your horse and your dog." Now, the youngest brother was no fool. He did not tie his horse up. He merely laid the hair over the top of its neck. He merely put one of the hairs over Chain Breaker's neck and did not tie them. When she sat him down, she was there. She fussed. She said, "Oh, such a fine young man to have inside of my house." And here, as he looked, he saw her reaching towards this bag, and he knew that there would be no good in this. And so he called out, "Chain Breaker!" And the dog rushed in and pinned the old woman down upon the ground and started to scratch at her. She yelled, "Stop, stop, please stop." "I will tell my dog to stop when you have released my brother." She took some of the dust and blew it into the lifeless stone form of his brother. And the brother stood up. "My brother, what a long and deep sleep I have had. I am pleased to see you." The woman, the youngest, said to her, "You must go and release my horse and my dog." And so she went into Chain Maker, to his horse. And now the youngest brother called for both dogs. "Chain Maker, Chain Breaker, kill this woman!" And sure enough, the 2 dogs ripped the old woman until she was nothing more than a stain of blood upon the ground. The 2 brothers went out and blew dust into all of the stones that surrounded the house, and the 2 of them watched as all of the people were brought back to life and travelled this way and that and forwards and backwards, rejoicing to be released from the stone. And now the 2 of them started to ride with their 2 horses, their 2 dogs, as 2 brothers. And as they were riding along, the youngest looked and said, "My brother, there is something that I feel that I need to tell you. There is something that I do not want to tell you." The oldest brother looked puzzled. "What is it?" The youngest brother spoke. "When I travelled from our home by the side of the sea, I went along the road and came to the great castle, and when I was there, the king thought that I was you." The oldest brother smiled. "Well, we are but twins. But it's not just that, my brother. Your wife thought that I was you." And here the oldest brother did not look pleased. "I did everything that I could, but I slept in the bed with your wife." And here the oldest brother took his sword and he struck his brother, struck him down with the golden sword, and left him there, dead. Now the oldest brother started to ride back towards the castle. And when he got there, the king hobbled and jumped with joy to see that he had returned yet again, not knowing that he had met the youngest brother. And his wife came down, the oldest sister, came down and hugged him and squeezed him and fed him. And that night, as they lay down in the bed, he laid himself down upon the bed and did not place the sword in between the two of them. His wife sat up. "My sweet husband, why do you not place a golden sword down the middle of the bed as you did the other night? Has your vow, has your task been fulfilled?" And the oldest brother realized that the younger had been so honourable that he had placed the sword down the middle of the bed, and now all he worried and wondered about was how he could try and make amends for unjustly killing his own brother. He could not sleep that night. He went out and he tried to find a way that he could bring his brother back to life, and he found that there was an old woman by the side of the road. She looked and said, "Kind sir, why are you so sad and troubled? What is it in this world?" And he spoke about how he had unjustly struck his brother down with his great sharp golden sword. The old woman smiled. "Up there at midday there will be a thin, scaly green lizard. It will be panting in the heat of the sun. And what you must do is this. You must take your golden sword and smite it and cut it into 2 parts, with one side at either side of your golden sword. Place them at the neck of your brother, and he will arise." The oldest brother went, and sure, by the stroke of midday, he went and found the long, thin, green, scaled lizard panting in the shadow of a boulder, and he struck it with one half upon one side of the sword and the other half upon the other, and he raced until he came to where his brother lay. And he took the 2 halves of the lizard and placed them on either side of his brother's neck. And no sooner had he rubbed the blood of the lizard upon the cut at his brother's throat than the brother leapt up. "My brother, what a strange sleep I have had." And he did not tell him of what he had done, but he knew just how honourable his younger brother had been, and the two of them rode all of the way back to the great castle. And it was there that the king was quite surprised, for when he looked, he could see 2 where once there had only been 1. And the oldest daughter looked, for she could not tell one from the other. It was only the oldest brother who spoke and said, "It is me. I am your husband." And the youngest, he got married to the youngest sister. And when the king died, for he only had 2 daughters, all of that kingdom was divided between the 2 daughters. And those 2 fishermen's sons lived inside of the castle with the horses, their dogs, and their wives, and lived and ruled so well.
The moon had always shone down upon the earth and scattered her beautiful silver light on all of the earth below her. She would look and see what men could do, and she envied them. She'd always stayed in the sky and always glowed with her silver light, but she always wanted to walk amongst all of the trees. She wanted to be able to smell flowers, to swim in a river or a lake, to know what it was to be just like a man. But how could she leave her place high in the sky, where she would give light to those men and women who would walk in the night? But her friends the clouds, they heard how sad the moon was and decided that they would help her. For one by one they filled all of the sky and told her that under the cover of the cloud she could go down to the earth, and no one would be the wiser, for all they would see were clouds and expect the moon to be on the other side of them, and she would be free to walk upon the earth. She loved it. She loved the feel of the warm soil upon her feet. She loved the smell of the flowers and the trees. She even went swimming in a lake. And when she went swimming, she started to drown. And who should help her but a farmer? A farmer who had a wife and a daughter, and he saved the moon from drowning. And when she was there by the side of the lake, a jaguar came, licking at its lips, using its pads, paws and claws to come ever closer to the moon. But again, the farmer used his knife and stabbed the jaguar and saved the moon. But now he looked at her. He said, "You must be tired. You must be cold. You must be hungry. You must come back to my farm, and there you can have food to eat." And as soon as the moon came into the house, the farmer's wife brought them cakes. And I'll tell you this, the moon loved the way that the food tasted. She ate cake after cake, one after another. She stuffed her mouth. She ate because she had never eaten before. And soon she had eaten every single piece of food that was inside of the house. But the farmer's wife said, "You are welcome. Welcome inside of our house. And whatever it is that we have, then you can have it too." The moon, at the end of all of her time, knew that it was time for her to rise back up and go back up into the air. And all through the day, all she could think about was the time that she had spent in the night upon the earth. And the next night, she parted the clouds and looked down, and there she could see the farmer's house, and his wife, and his daughter. But she had eaten everything inside of their house. There was nothing left for them. They were hungry and they were cold, and the moon wept, large round silvery tears that fell from her cheeks and fell from the tip of her chin, the size of a diamond. And she asked her brothers, the clouds, to let a mist fall upon the ground all around the farmer's house. And then the next morning, when that special mist and the moon's tears had fallen, trees grew that no one had ever seen before. Trees, evergreen trees. Trees that had white flowers and now are known as the Jerba Matte. The farmer's daughter never died, and she is the one who owns and makes mate for everyone to drink. It's a fine drink, made from the leaves of the Jerba Matte. It makes those who are weak strong. It makes those who have no friends, friends in spirit with all who share mate with them. It makes those who are weak strong, those who are friendless with friends. and it pleases everyone to drink Mate. Neva was a good, strong woman and the wife of the head of the tribe. And in the place where she lived, everyone lived in thatched cottages and tried to sleep in hammocks. And when I say try to sleep, it's because the Creator had not made day and night. All there was the sun shining in the sky all of the time. And the men did not know when it was day or night. The children did not know when it was time to go to bed. And all the men would do would be to go out and fish and look after the crops and to look after the animals. And the women would have to look after the children and cook and clean. And since there was no day and since there was no night, all of the time they would be cooking and cleaning and looking after the men. The men would say, we would like to be able to sit and rest. The men would say that we do not want to have to work all of the time looking after the crops and the animals and fishing. We would like to spend some time in darkness, and we would like to sit and talk and smoke by the side of fires. The women would say, we would just like to have a rest from having to cook and clean all of the day for all of the men and the children. Neva's husband, Nahua, would like to have had a chance to rest, but there was no day and there was no night. So he couldn't believe it when he saw his son, Cochipil. Cochipil was in the kitchen while his mother cooked, was in the kitchen, and he looked, and in the corner he could see that there was something dark. Well, he looked to see what it was, and as Cochipil looked inside, he could see that it was a mouse, and the mouse itself was wrapped in darkness. He told his mother, he said, Mother, I have seen a mouse, and the mouse has darkness wrapped about it. Perhaps the mouse has a night. Cochipil had told Neva, and Neva told her husband. Nahua looked and said, if the mouse has got a night, then why can't we have a night? And he spoke with his son. He said, Cochipil, what I want you to do is this. I want you to go and try and trick the mouse out of its night. If the mouse has a night, then men should have a night, and we can rest, we can sleep in the darkness, and we will be able to sit by the side of the fires and talk and rest. So Cochipil went down on all fours in the kitchen and looked to try and see where he could see the mouse hole, where the mouse was, where the night was creeping out. On all fours he took some of the meat that he'd been given for his dinner and he placed it in the front of the mouse hole, one bit after another, to try and draw the mouse out. Well, the smell of the fine food that Cochipil had left for the mouse was too much for the mouse, and out it crept, whiskers and nose, head and tail. And Cochipil went down and he grabbed hold of the mouse and said, oh, my fine fellow mouse, please, I see that you have a night. Please, could I have some of that night to borrow for my mother and my father? The mouse was no fool. What would there be in this for me?
"Oh, mouse, mouse, mouse," said Coachapeel, "I shall make sure that you get fine scraps every day. I shall give them to you. I will find some fine, fat, meaty cockroaches for you to eat." At the prospect of food, the mouse was very willing to give its night to Coachapeel, at least just one night. And the mouse crouched down, and thick black smoke of the night came from out of its eyes and its ears and from the tip of its snout, and it curled right up and into the sky, and the sun tried to hide from it and hid underneath the darkness, and the first night came. The men rejoiced. They'd never had a night so dark. They'd never had any night at all. And they sat there and lit fires and decided that now they would talk and sit and smoke. And the women, who were much cleverer than men, decided that this was a time to lay themselves down inside of their hammocks. But I've got to tell you this.
But no sooner had the night started than the night was over, for the mouse's night was too short. The men had spent their time talking by the side of the fires when they could have slept, and now Nahua decided that he would go with all of his warriors to try and find an animal's night that was longer than just a wink or a blink of an eye. All of his men made themselves ready. They went out hunting. And in the forest there were shadows, but at one point they could see something that was darker than a shadow, and it was a tapir. Nahua thought that if a mouse can have a night, then all of the other animals can have a night, and perhaps some of their nights will be longer. The men surrounded the tapir. The tapir was there, and before they struck, they spoke. "Tapir, if you would wish to live, then you must give up your night to us, so that we will know day from night, that we will know what it is to rest in a hammock and not have a night that is more than just an instant." At the prospect of being killed, the tapir quite willingly gave up his night.
And a thick, dense, oily night slipped and slithered from out of the tapir's body. It rose into the sky, and again the sun hid beyond the horizon, and the second night came. And for the first time, the men and women saw the stars in the sky. Some of them were frightened by the stars, but many thought that they were like friendly tigers' eyes looking down at them. And even though the mouse's night had been so short, the men still lit fires and sat and talked and waited, and it was only as they got sleepy that they decided that they would lay inside of their hammocks. And when they lay asleep, the darkness wrapped itself about them, and they had dreams. The first of their dreams in the darkness of the night. And they slept, and they slept, and they slept.
And when they awoke the next day, they discovered that the roofs of the houses had all collapsed. The crops had grown and rotted. The houses were overgrown. The kitchens were filled with weeds, and the tapir's night had been too long. They had to replant the crops. They had to go and catch all of their cattle. They had to go out and remake their boats so that they could go out fishing. The tapir's night had been far too long. The boy, Coachapeel, had found a mouse's night. The man had found the tapir's night, which was too long. And now it was neither. She decided that she would go out
and she would try and find a night that was not too short or too long. She would find a night that would be just right. So the tapir's night had been a disaster. It had been too long. All of the crops had failed, and it was Neva, as she was trying to dig out her kitchen and find all of her pots and pans, that she decided that she would find a night that was just the right length. Cochipil had found a mouse's night, and it was too quick. The hunters had found the tapir's night, and it was too long. But she, as a woman, was going to go out and find a night that would be not too short and not too long. And she announced, she stood in the middle of the village and said, I, as a woman, am going to find a night that will be not too long or too short. Some of the men laughed at her. Cochipil had wished that his night had been longer, but she decided that she would go to the middle of the thickest part of the forest, where some shadows would lie, and perhaps there she would find an animal that would have a night that was neither too short nor too long. And in one of the parts of the forest that she had never been to before, she looked and she saw that there was a small, round, hard ball. And she knew exactly who it was. It was Tattoo, the armadillo. She spoke softly, with a voice as sweet as honey. Tattoo, Tattoo, please wake up. But Tattoo was no fool, and did not move 1 inch. Tattoo, Tattoo, please wake up. Tattoo, Tattoo, please wake up. Now she was a woman with womanly wiles, and she went over to Tattoo and she scratched in between the hard armoured bands of his skin and started to tickle him. And there is no one who can resist. And she kept on tickling and kept on tickling at Tattoo's skin until he could stand it no more. And he poked out his short, sharp snout. What is it that you want, woman? Oh, Tattoo, said Neva. Tattoo, I would wish for you to lend me your night. Tattoo did not want to lose his night, and so he looked and said, what is it that would be in this deal for me? Oh, Tattoo. And now she stroked at his hard-armoured skin. Tattoo, Tattoo. I would make sure that for all of time, you would always have the scraps of food from the kitchen, and they would be yours forever and always. Now, at the thought of food, Tattoo uncurled himself. Well, woman, I shall lend you my night, but only for 1 night. Oh, I promise, said Neva. I do promise. You shall only have to give me 1 night. Then I would not be too tired. Then the men would know when to go to work and when to sleep. Just 1 night. I promise. It was truly the thought of all of that food that allowed Tattoo to resist his God. And the night started to creep about the world, and the sun started to set. The sun hid in the darkness behind the clouds, and the dark was good, and it was a good night. The men decided that they would only light their fires and talk and smoke for a short time, for they had learned from the mouse's night that it may only be for a short time. And they lay in their hammocks and they dreamed dreams of from so long ago. And the night was good. But the next day, when the darkness had gone and the dawn had broken, and the men had had a good sleep, and everyone was rested, and the women didn't have to do so much work and cook and clean right through the night, the men, when they found out that Neva had promised Tattoo that she would give the night back, they refused. They said that they would keep it for now, forever, and for all time. Neva had promised, but the men refused. They broke that promise. They kept the night, and they never gave it back. And now, you may find that there will be an armadillo at the kitchen door in the darkness of night, waiting for the scraps of food that it was promised, as it will scratch upon the ground. And it will sleep during the day and try and steal back the night that was stolen from it.